On the eve of the 2022 midterm elections, pollsters remind us that polling data only shows current trends but not election outcomes. We only have to go back to 2016 when polls showed an 85% chance that Hillary Clinton would win the presidential election. What we are seeing today, however, is that Americans are voting early in unprecedented numbers. As of Thursday, 32 million votes have already been cast. On top of that, it's an article of faith among Republicans that voters should show up on Election Day only. As the New York Times says, far more Americans now vote early or by mail, and far more Republicans now avoid mail ballots and vote in person. Trends that have upended traditional voting models and prompted election experts and political operatives to caution against reading too much into this year's early vote totals. And the Times' Nate Cohn writes that, quote, most of the polling over the last few weeks is coming from partisan outfits, usually Republican or auto-dial firms. And these polls are cheap enough to flood the zone, and many of them were emboldened by the 2020 election when their final results came close to the election results, even as other pollsters struggled. On that note, Democratic operative Simon Rosenberg tweeted that, quote, the red wave didn't show up in the 5 House specials. It didn't show up in Kansas. It isn't showing up in the early vote. It isn't showing up in the Senate battlegrounds. It may come, but it's not here yet. He reminds us in an interview with Politico that, quote, every election is unique. Every election has its own contours. And he quips that traditional polling is lazy and that in an age of Trump, you can't be lazy. That said, many mainstream outlets still rely on traditional polling trends. The Washington Post's top headline Friday blares, Democrats fear midterm drubbing as party leaders rush to defend blue seats. What we can definitively say today is that we don't know what will happen until the ballots are counted. This election also revolves around the economy. Friday's October jobs report shows a resilient economy with job gains of 261,000. This is not what Federal Reserve policy experts had predicted, nor even wanted. The Fed has been raising interest rates to cool the economy so as to dampen inflation, which still sits at a 40-year high of 8.2%, while unemployment remains at a record low of 3.7%. As the Fed seeks to loosen up the job market, frustrated Democratic senators penned a scathing letter to Fed Chairman Jerome Powell, complaining that, quote, while the Federal Reserve is charged with the dual mandate of promoting maximum employment, stable prices, and moderate long-term interest rates in the U.S. economy, it is your job to combat inflation, but at the same time, you must not lose sight of your responsibility to ensure that we have full employment. The letter continues that we must avoid having our short-term advances and strong labor market overwhelmed by the consequences of aggressive monetary actions to decrease inflation, address its main drivers, especially when the Fed's actions do not address its main drivers. And it says that for working Americans who already feel the crush of inflation, job losses will make it much worse. You can't risk the livelihoods of millions of Americans who can't afford it. And the Senate Banking Chair, Sherrod Brown, concludes, I ask that you don't forget your responsibility to promote maximum employment, and that the decisions you make at the next FOMC meeting reflect your commitment to the dual mandate of the Federal Reserve. In a surprising turn, the GOP, thanks to its culture war, is divorcing itself from its longtime ally in big business, the Chamber of Commerce. This split may have begun with Florida Governor Ron DeSantis' public feud with Disney over the company's opposition to Florida's parental rights education law, dubbed by some as the, quote, don't say gay law. Now, that clash has bled over to the House of Representatives, where Republican House Minority Leader Kevin McCarthy is telling the Chamber CEO Suzanne Clark that the organization must make a complete change in leadership if Republicans will work with the Chamber of Commerce. According to Axios, McCarthy is also upset that the chamber endorsed 23 Democratic freshmen for re-election. 15 of those lawmakers won, putting the speakership out of reach for McCarthy at the time. And whatever the reason, this incipient split between Republicans and business marks a turning point in American politics. From the White House, this is Douglas Christian.